What's up, geeks and gamers? It's Odin coming back with another video, and today we've got the box office breakdown for the weekend of January 3rd to January 5th. And once again, coming in at number 1 is Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. However, what I find the most interesting is the fact that it is barely ahead of a film that's been out for one extra week, and that, of course, is Jumanji 3: The Next Level, making $26.5 million, only a 25% drop for Jumanji, while the Rise of Skywalker has yet another over 50% drop in its third week. It was projected to have a 49% drop. Obviously, those numbers were definitely above what they expected, and therefore the movie is just not making as much as they think. Now, is the movie flopping? No, the movie is not flopping. In fact, as of today, based on the numbers that I have, the movie has finally now, as of today, become profitable. And some people might try to argue the numbers and say that there's certain numbers and certain figures that we don't quite know the exact totals for, and that's definitely a possibility. But based on the calculations that I've made, the film is now making money. But it looks like this film is going to be one of the worst performing Star Wars films, other than, of course, Solo: A Star Wars Story, could potentially even, when adjusted for inflation, not match up to the numbers brought about by Rogue One: A Star Wars Story, making this the second worst performing Star Wars film. So even though it's likely going to cross the $1 billion mark, even though it is now at this point profitable, the fact that we're still talking about this movie not doing as well as some of the others that came out in the franchise, when this itself is the end of the Skywalker saga, the end of the 9-film arc, what was supposed to be the biggest Star Wars movie of all time, I think just speaks absolute volume. So just a few more movies that we have to talk about. Little Women came in with a strong $13.5 million. That film is actually doing very well, despite the fact that the media are starting to complain because men aren't going to see it in the droves that they expect them to because of, reasons. The Grudge came out with an $11.3 million start, which doesn't seem that impressive, but when you take into account the film only cost $10 million to make, it's actually not too bad when you think about it. Frozen 2 has now crossed the $1.3 billion mark at the box office, which is insane because I just don't think it's that great of a film. Spies in Disguise is going to be a giant flop for 20th Century Fox, so I guess a giant flop for Disney now that they own them. And Knives Out, the Rian Johnson film, continues to do very strongly, and we'll get into those numbers in a second. So let's start off with The Rise of Skywalker. This movie is now at $918 million in the worldwide box office totals. That means that the film will likely cross $1 billion either by next weekend or by the weekend after that. I suspect probably somewhere in between that part will finally reach the $1 billion mark, especially when you have the fact that movies like 1917, which has been very hyped, probably will end up knocking this film out of the number 1 spot next weekend at the box office if this 50% drop continues to happen. So again, first weekend, or rather the second weekend drop was 59%. This weekend comes in at 53%. Seems like a lot of people are just not going to see this movie a second time. Yes, a lot of people have gone to see it, and that's the reason why it has made so much money, but it doesn't have, or doesn't seem to have at this point, based on the numbers in front of us, that rewatchability factor that many other films and many other big franchise films especially have had in previous times. And in fact, when you go ahead and compare this, because one of the biggest comparisons that we can really make for this film is, of course, to a film called The Last Jedi. But what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to add another film into the discussion, and that's going to be Rogue One: A Star Wars Story, because I think when you look at the overall numbers, it brings up a very interesting comparison. So let's go ahead and just look at the day-to-day totals here. So for The Rise of Skywalker, the third Sunday is projected to come in at around $8 million, which is very, very low when you compare it to the other films. Last Jedi at this same point in time had a $13 million Sunday, while Rogue One: A Star Wars Story had a $16 million Sunday. So once again, we have this film just not really competing, not really doing as well compared to the other films. Yes, it had those strong numbers early on. It had a very strong Christmas Day showing, of course, but it doesn't seem to be holding off. It does not seem to have the legs that the other films had previously, especially Rogue One, because Rogue One did not have a massive opening weekend. Remember that first Friday, compare that to all the other films. Rogue One had a $71 million Friday compared to a $104 and $89 million respectively for The Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker, and yet it continued to do well both here domestically and overseas, especially overseas, and that's the reason why that film was eventually able to cross the $1 billion mark. We don't really see that same passion overseas for The Rise of Skywalker. It is still performing domestically, but I think that a story is definitely worth telling when you look at the numbers. But let's go ahead and just look at one more thing. Now this movie, The Rise of Skywalker, is $67 million behind where The Last Jedi was at this same point in time, and is only about $26 million million ahead of where Rogue One was. Keeping in mind, this is before you adjust for inflation, meaning that is essentially running neck and neck with Rogue One at this point in time, which I think is an interesting story nonetheless. But let's look at the overall numbers. So Rogue One came out in 2016, Last Jedi 2017, of course, Rise of Skywalker 2019. When you look at the production budgets, they say 20 or 75 million. I just really don't buy that number because there were some projections for The Last Jedi having it over $300 million. Many articles have been posting about that. Many industry articles have posted about that, which is why it's not just a random number I'm picking up. So it seems to indicate that this film likely is closer to that number that I gave it, which was $350 million when you take into account reshoots that, based on things we've been seeing, basically have been confirmed. The level and how many reshoots, that's still very much a giant question mark, but some reshoots have definitely happened at some point, which makes me think this number is not nearly as high as it probably should be. When you look at the overall domestic worldwide openings, though, as you can see, 177 and 155, again, much closer to the Rogue One opening was Rise of Skywalker, which, again, the 9th film in a franchise, the end of the Skywalker saga. You would expect this movie to be doing so much better, but here, to me, is where the interesting story is, because when you adjust for inflation, Rogue One made $556 million at the domestic marketplace, and I just don't really see a place where Rise of Skywalker reaches that amount of money. You take into account that this film is probably going to match, if not slightly surpass, Rogue One in the international marketplace. That still remains to be seen, but this number here, unfortunately, cannot be adjusted for inflation since every single country has different rates of inflation, and so it's an almost impossible feat. I really wish that someone who is a math expert could dive into those numbers and let us know what the exact number is, but you're looking at a situation where the overall total for Rogue One, A Star Wars Story, was $1.056 million, but when you adjust at the very least for the domestic inflation, that makes it at $1.080 billion. So now you have a situation where, yeah, you're probably going to see Rise of Skywalker cross $1 billion in the next week or two. But the question then remains, but how much money can it make once you have other films that are going to start to compete against it? When 1917 comes out, when you have the films coming out later in January, is it going to be able to continue to bring in money when already without competition, people are not going to see it at least second, third, fourth viewings? I think that is something that is worth talking about, and is something that we simply cannot ignore. There's no doubt in my mind that this movie is not going to match the $1.3 billion of The Last Jedi, and we are now at the point where we can talk about where will it stand in relation to Rogue One, A Star Wars Story, when, as I showed previously, when you adjust for inflation, domestically at the very least, it is pretty much on par, or possibly even underperforming what Rogue One: A Star Wars Story did. This is, again, an incredible time to be alive when you have a film like Jumanji: The Next Level that is actually doing better financially as far as actual net gains at the box office than a freaking Star Wars movie. So that's something that we'll be keeping an eye on in the future. So Jumanji: The Next Level came in at $610 million as of this weekend. Still making a lot of money. Definitely not, I think, as great of a showing as maybe they thought it was going to be, not performing as well as the previous installment did. The previous installment was insane, got very close to $1 billion. This one is still doing very well, though. It's made lots of profit. We'll go into the profit margins in a second, but doing very well. Little Women, the film that people are now complaining about because not enough people are seeing it, is actually doing relatively well, $66 million on a smaller budget. The Grudge, which has $10 million budget, $17.1 million, makes this film almost profitable. So it's probably going to be breaking even by the time next weekend comes around, which, with bad ratings aside from both critics and audiences, is just an amazing feat. When you think about a film like The Grudge costing so little and yet still making money, and yet you have now Star Wars films in the canon like Solo that lost money at the box office, I don't know. It just kind of makes you laugh when you think about it. Frozen 2, as I said, is now crossed the $1.3 billion range, which just makes me frustrated because it's not a good movie. Spies in Disguise is continuing to flop, making $88.8 million. But remember, this is now a Disney-owned property, and so that means it's going to be a financial loss for Disney. And Knives Out, a film by Rian Johnson, and a very pretentious film by Rian Johnson. I actually finally watched it the other day, and oh my goodness, this dude has such, we talk about having thin skin. This dude wrote characters and lines in his movie specifically to attack people that were critical of his movie The Last Jedi. And I'm not even lying about that. There are lines about people online in his movie, and it's very obviously geared towards people that are critical of him. It's pretty hilarious when you really look at it all around. But going to my handy dandy chart, over here on Google Sheets, I can show you the current box office range and the current gain-loss ratio. So the Rise of Skywalker, as I said, based on the numbers that I have, and obviously whether the production budget is that high or the marketing is higher than the industry standard, it's really up for debate at this point. But basically, based on the numbers I have, it is now in the black, making $26.2 million, where Cats, unfortunately... It's still flopping around negative $116 million. Little Women is still in the red as well, and obviously they're going to blame that on the fact that men apparently aren't seeing it because men can't support women, even though you look at the trailer and you realize, no, this doesn't really seem like a movie that's trying to say, hey, guys, come on in. Not to say guys won't go to see it, but let's just be honest for a second. Guys tend to be drawn towards certain types of films, just like women tend to be drawn towards certain types of films, but we can't talk about that because, God forbid, that there's differences between men and women in today's society. Spice in the Skies is looking at an over $100 million loss. It probably will get closer to the $100 million loss range by the end of its run, but it's just not making any money, so it's really hard to... It's going to be a loss no matter what. We finally have the first 2 weeks of this movie, and that means that the average gain it likely will have or rather the likely loss it'll have is around $75 million in the red. So that's $75 million loss for Disney. So interesting that they picked up Fox and decided to go ahead with this movie at Christmas, going up against Star Wars, which... again, is now profitable, but not really by a whole lot. Frozen 2, very impressive, almost a $500 million net gain profit from that, but still not nearly as impressive as the Joker's $553 million, where you have Jumanji 3, which is now $178 million in the black, a very profitable movie for that, and has a very good chance of being more profitable than a film like The Rise of Skywalker, which, if you had told me 5 years ago, hey, guess what, they're going to remake Jumanji, and then they're going to have a sequel to that remake. And then obviously it's a sequel. It's a remake. It's a reboot sequel is basically what I like to call that second film. And now the third film as well. That film is going to be more profitable than a Star Wars movie in 2019. I would have laughed at your face, as most people would. And yet, here we are. The numbers are in front of us, and the numbers really don't lie. But what I want to know is, what are your thoughts about, especially when it comes to Star Wars? Do you think that Rogue One is going to be more profitable? Or not obviously it'll be more profitable because of the way the budgets work, but do you think that at the worldwide box office, you could see The Rise of Skywalker coming in underneath what Rogue One did? Obviously, when you adjust for inflation, and if we are able to get the international numbers for inflation, I just don't really think it's going to even be close, because I imagine at the very least, if you adjust for inflation in all the markets, this movie would have to be around $1.1 billion in revenue. But at the end, or rather in the worldwide box office, and that is definitely something that The Rise of Skywalker could potentially reach. But the fact that this movie is slowing down so much has now fallen so far behind what The Last Jedi was doing, and likely will continue to. Again, if this is the Sunday number, and you almost always see drop-offs from Sunday to Monday, and also tomorrow is the day where most people go back to school and work if they've been off, I can't imagine the Monday number is going to be very high, at least not nearly high enough to match the $14 or even $15 million that Rogue One saw. And I just don't really think it's going to be able to pick up back from that. Obviously, here you have 6 million, 50 million, 10 million, and 6 million here, which was a drop off of about 50%. Assuming we have another 50% drop once again this coming weekend, which seems very likely at this point for Rise of Skywalker, you'll see very similar numbers, possibly even coming in underneath that. So any person that said, oh, it might match what the domestic numbers were for Last Jedi, I mean, that's pretty much gone at this point in time, and there's actually a very good chance that it will not match up the adjusted inflation numbers for Rogue One: A Star Wars Story, which tells us all we really need to know about the current state of Star Wars. But anyway, let me know your thoughts about all these numbers in the comments section below. If you like this video, smash the like button, give us a subscribe. It helps us a lot. You're all amazing, beautiful people. Have a wonderful day, and as always, God bless.